Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. So excited, so absolutely excited about this particular installment. You're going to notice that my partner in crime today is not the world famous Dave Russell because he is famously traveling around the world. Instead, super excited. This is a longtime Veeamer. She got distracted, went over to Microsoft for a little while, but we pulled her back into the fray now that she can speak more than one cloud. Leah, thank you so much for joining us today and welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so Leah, you're in Columbus, right?
I am a big OHIO to any college football fans. Somehow, some way, we made it into the playoffs. I'm not sure how. I'm not sure we're quite deserving, but sometimes chaos is a ladder. For any Game of Thrones fans out there, that is a lovely quote for you guys. So hopefully I'm spanning all the fandoms, college football, Game of Thrones. I can pull up a Star Wars reference somewhere, I'm sure.
And we will probably get to that. In the
Yes.
meantime, though, along with Ohio, the Ohio, whatever.
There's
Um,
only 4 letters, Jason.
Yeah, I'm an Aggie. I can't count. Anyway, so we got Ohio represented. We got Georgia with our producer, Mark. I am, of course, from the great state of Texas. Our social is being covered out of Romania today. Good morning, Catronel. Please let us know where you're from. We're going to revisit the map over time. And of course, our mission in life is to turn the world Veeam green. And we do that one country at a time. So please let us know where you're coming from. And again, as I mentioned, Leah is a long time Veeamer. And has been in more than one hyperscale cloud in her life. So as we talk about clouds today, as you come up with questions, I think it'd be great for us to kind of take a swing at. So please bring your questions and tell us where you're from. All right, so this is part of a series that we're doing based on Veeam's most recent research publication called the Cloud Protection Trends Report for 2023. Came out in November. It's built around 1,700 organizations, what they're doing in IaaS, what they're doing in PaaS, what they're doing in SaaS, and then what are the data protection ramifications of those usage considerations. You can actually download the report from the QR code in the lower right-hand corner, or you can go to vee.am/CPT, Cloud Protection Trends 23. All right, so that's the plug for the report, and you can follow along because some of these charts are going to be the very same ones we're going to use. But let's start with kind of laying the table. Leah, 2 weeks ago, Sam Nichols from your team joined us, and we talked about the adoption in IaaS and PaaS. I want to revisit that trend line just to kind of set the table for where we're at. But last week we were just talking about the production use of IaaS and PaaS. This week, you're going to help us really double down on what does that mean for data protection strategy and who's actually enacting those strategies. But let's start with the top line data. So this actually comes not from CPT. It actually comes from the Data Protection Trends Report. We've been doing that report for the last 4+ years. And every year we ask organizations what percentage of your servers are physical. You can see those lines on the left. What percentage are virtual machines in the data center? You can see those lines in the middle. And then the net result is what percentage of the machines are cloud hosted, typically using IaaS or in a managed service provider. You can see those on the right-hand side. And it seems like we see 3 kind of pretty clean stories. Certainly physical servers, that left-hand set, it's a gradual decline. But I don't think it's because physical servers are going away. It's because what I think we've heard is that organizations are launching new workloads. Those new workloads are cloud first. And so what happens, it ends up diluting the percentage of servers that are still physical and virtual within the data center. And so that's what you see on the left is a gradual dilution of physical within the broader landscape. You can see in the middle, virtual is relatively flat, 23, 25, 24, 24, pretty nice and flat and even. And then all that net sum gain on that right-hand side, which is probably why you came back to Veeam, is look at how much data has to be protected, which is now cloud hosted along that way. In fact, I think it's cool that we are in December of 2022. And when you look on that chart, In 2022, 49% of workloads are supposed to be cloud hosted. And in 2023, a mere 26 days away, that stat is expected to be 52%. We crushed the threshold at half over. Over half of our workloads are presumably going to be cloud hosted. Leah, does that ring true to you, and why do you think that is?
Yeah, it certainly does. And I think when we look bottoms up on why that strategy happens, and we're going to talk a bit more about this in today's call, we look at it from a human perspective, right? So let's say I am an AWS engineer or an Azure architect, and I'm really thinking about what is going to be my transformational strategy. The breadth of services that the cloud offers, plus the elasticity, means that it's a really great option for those net new workloads. But what we're also seeing is that in a lot of cases, workloads that have been running on premises for a long time are looking at transitioning from on-premises to the cloud. And in fact, some of the research we've seen suggests that of the workloads that are running in the cloud today, 1/3 of them were net new. The other 2/3 were some kind of transformational initiative. Now, that doesn't always mean it's perfect. And certainly we've also seen other pieces of research to suggest that sometimes everything isn't roses and the cloud is not necessarily perfect. And that's, I think, driven by the fact that there's so many workloads that have rapidly moved to the cloud in the last few years, whether that's, again, the top-down approach of having a cloud first strategy, a sort of mandate approach, as opposed to really thinking critically about each individual workload's needs. But a lot of that has to do with market changes, right? When I was at Microsoft, I actually was on the OEM team, and I spent a lot of time working with our storage partners and spent a lot of time being very aware of supply chain and other kinds of market conditions dramatically affecting what can actually hit from an inventory perspective for those servers, and certainly for the metal running under virtualization. So I think there's this push and pull on both sides of what the actual infrastructure teams are faced with versus what the top line leaders of the business are saying. And everything's kind of smushing together in the middle. And that means that we're having to bring a lot of new people to the table. And I think, Jason, that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today.
It is. Before we get into the diversity of the people that are sitting around the table, though, let's take a look at the diversity of the audience that's coming in. The map has really been lighting up right away. So let's take a look at the Americas first. And we got I have my neighbors to the east. Louisiana is representing. Florida in the house. Always good to see y'all. And my neighbors to the south in Mexico, Texas and the little places around Texas. I love that. If we go back to the old country, we can see Germany's in the house and Poland. Awesome. And good morning. Back down South America, we got Argentina in the house. That's fantastic. Love it when the big countries pile in, right? Because just big old chunks of the map turn green along the way. And then what do we got? We got Turkey, we got Egypt, and India over in that upper right-hand corner. Yeah, please keep piling on. Tell us where you're from and throw some questions along the way. All right, so we did talk about the diversity of the audience. Let's get back to that diversity of who's sitting around the table, who's actually affecting data protection strategy. So one of the questions in the most recent Cloud Protection Trends report, and there's actually two nuances to this. The first one is who's defining the strategy and requirements. And then the next question we're going to look at is who's actually clicking the mouse. But let's do this one first. When organizations were asked which teams were responsible for involved in determining the strategy and requirements for protecting cloud-hosted data, I think it's interesting, when we did the Cloud Protection Trends in 2021, Central IT was top of the list, right? But it wasn't so flat. There weren't as many cloud. There were far less data protection. There were even far less application owners. It seems like we've really kind of rebalanced, and we've got 4 flat lines on this. That's interesting to me in that, okay, how are you going to make a decision? But I'm going to leave that to each individual table. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And certainly, even when we've spoken anecdotally with partners and certainly some of our sales teams as well, they're seeing the folks who are coming to the table dramatically expand. Interestingly, when we were at the Veeam 100 Summit back in October in Prague talking about Veeam with our Vanguards and with our Legends. We asked a couple of folks, have you started to see some of these new people at the table? And one of the faces that was new that a lot of people were really impressed by is that the security teams are getting involved. I think
Love
they're
that.
finding that, absolutely. I think they're finding that due to the rapid expansion of where workloads are living, from SaaS to platform as a service to infrastructure as a service, edge, obviously lots of great buzzwords, but at least from a security perspective, those folks are feeling a tremendous amount of heartburn because their threat landscape is dramatically expanding. So that means that we really need to pull all of these teams together and really work together effectively, and really treat backup like a first-class citizen rather than something that's simple to have. But how we do that is tough. And certainly we're going to talk a bit about some of the choices that these folks have to make of, whether it's a main platform solution like Veeam that can do it all, whether it's a point product, and what are the pros and cons of that. But certainly anecdotally, we're hearing exactly what you're seeing on the screen here. And again, as Jason's been saying, please, jump in the chat if you guys have had this experience too, of now for the first time ever, you're hearing from maybe your Azure engineer, or you're hearing from the security team, hey, what are we doing in the backup space? How can I help make sure that it's really integrated well from a threat tolerance perspective, or from compliance, whatever that driver may be. So please fill us in the chat what you guys are hearing, but certainly on my side, Jason, I've been hearing it too.
Makes sense. Now, that said, so lots of different folks saying this is what it needs to look like. And I love the fact that if you actually look at this list, every one of them does actually have a very unique point of view that if you are missing that lens, you probably don't actually have a fully comprehensive perspective on what's really necessary to protect that data. Now, that said, let's look at who's actually responsible at the end of the day and clicking the mouse, right? Who's actually doing the work. Now, this actually is two different cuts of the same question. So in this survey, 1,700 organizations were surveyed, and the question was, in general, who manages the backups or the data protection of cloud-hosted servers within your organization? Now, what I want to do is ignore the bluish green wedge in that upper left-hand corner for a second. Let's just look at the lime green and the orange, right? So about 52% of organizations say the backup team is responsible. About 22% are using the cloud. Cloud admins are doing that. Now, it wasn't that many years ago that those numbers were nearly reversed, that it was the cloud admin who was doing the work. And I'm okay with that because historically, I've been in data protection for 32 years, right? And almost every time that there is a new platform that comes out, the platform owner is the first person responsible for protecting it, because nobody else in the organization understands what's necessary to back up that platform, right? 15 years ago, when virtualization was brand new in the data center, it wasn't the backup team that was backing up VMs. They tried, they put agents inside of every VM and found out that was a train wreck. Right? So instead, the virtualization admin, that V admin, was responsible for backing up virtualization because they're the only ones who understood what it took. And so it'd be normal that when cloud first came out, that cloud admins were doing the backups for that. But we have seen over the last 2.5 years since the last version of this report published, a true juxtapositioning between those two, where today about 52, 22, so 2 to 1. 2.5 to 3 to 2, whatever you want to say for that. A 2 to 1 ratio basically on backup team versus cloud team. Now, if the organization is using backup as a service, then the backup as a service team is responsible for actually doing the jobs about 1/4 of the time, and yet the rest of the time it's still that same ratio. So I love the fact that the vast majority of backups are being done by the backup team, and yet there are some folks that still say, it's my kit, I'm on the hook to make sure it's running, I'm going to do the backups. Let's get into product for just a second on this one, because we serve both of them as first-class users, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a way that you can have a sort of one person that's directly responsible, that DRI role. Absolutely, I think makes sense to be backup. And that's because the backup folks really understand what it takes to be hypervigilant about the availability of data. They understand best practices. They can really map that effectively regardless of where that infrastructure piece resides. I do want to point out, though, Just because you're doing the point and click, or just because you're the DRI, does not mean that these other folks are not involved. For example, the cloud administrators may need to be involved from a bill management perspective. We talk about on the cloud side of the business a lot, something called bill shock. If anybody has ever dealt in the cloud before, you take a look at your AWS bill one month and it might be wildly different than what it was the previous month. And it could be something as simple as a policy was changed or a new feature was implemented that simply hadn't been budgeted correctly. The cloud administrators are going to know those implications and certainly be the DRI for the cloud bill much more effectively than the backup team would. Another way that these folks often get involved is on the recovery side. And this is where, again, the cloud business really understands how to manage this effectively from an identity and access management point of view. But Veeam can do it too with something called role-based access controls. So you can very easily open up to the Azure DBA, to the AWS file admin, open up those sort of recovery type of initiatives and opportunities so that they can do some of their own minor recovery without you on the backup side breaking what you need to do in order to really manage this effectively. So this is certainly a good kind of chart to take a look at from a high level to think more critically about how the trend is changing, but there's certainly a deeper story to be had here.
So something that you said, I want to pull that back out because I think there's some real gold in that. And that is, you described a scenario where the backup team might be the ones predominantly responsible for backing up, and yet enabling the cloud administrators to be the ones predominantly responsible for restore, right? And I think there's some fantasticness in there because one of our dear colleagues, Corinne Bissett, when she first saw that graph, she said, well, if the backup team is charged with doing the backups, that means the backups are actually getting done, right? And so the idea of if the backup team is actually responsible for, let's say, call it paying the tax every day and every week and every month, then when you actually have to make a claim, which is really how, we should think about backup in many ways, it's like insurance, you can actually do that because those premiums have been paid each and every day along the way. So I love the idea of the central team is responsible for making sure that backups occur and yet enabling the file admin, the DBA, the Azure architect, et cetera, to be the one to do those restore operations in the context that they're used to. We don't have time to talk about explorers today, but that's certainly the next part of what we would normally have in a Veeam-centric conversation. But we're not there today. We're going to talk about research stuff instead. So I want to go into this next slide. This one I think is rather interesting, and excuse me. It shows that we are still so new in market as a methodology, right? So, I'm going to tout that 32-year thing again. I've been doing backup a really long time. Every time that a new platform comes out, the original manufacturer of the platform always comes out with some cursory, basic, thing so you can make copies of your stuff. Because the inability to make copies of your stuff is a huge deployment blocker and adoption blocker by mainstream IT, right? You mentioned you had some time at Microsoft. I had some time at Microsoft. My years were much earlier. One of the jobs that I had actually was the NT backup utility, the built-in backup utility. And no one would ever tell you that that was a replacement for commercial backup. But it was so that you could make some kind of copy of your stuff. Right? And NetWare had it before, and Windows had the utility, and VMware had VCB, and never in the history of ever has the built-in utility been the right answer for large commercial data protection architectures. And I think that's what you're seeing here. It might be the most expensive,
though, right?
I'm sorry?
It might be the most expensive, though, if the storage vendor is creating their own backup and it's copies of data.
Oh, yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah, it might end up being something that makes you buy more storage. Who would have thought of that business model?
It does drive a significant amount of consumption now that you mention it. But I wouldn't want to bash their motives as far as they're doing that. No. I believe they're doing it for all the right altruistic reasons of just wanting to give you copies of your stuff. But that being said, that's usually the foundation on which most third-party backup usually starts, right? And I think we're seeing that here. So when both IaaS admins, those folks that are on the production side, as well as backup admins were asked, what data protection mechanisms are you aware of? Not what do you use, but what are you aware of? You do see that native snapshotting built in, because I promise if you can create a LUN in an IaaS host, there's an option right there. Would you like to snapshot while you're there? Right? So yeah, that's pretty obvious. Then there's the, hey, we have a utility for this. The problem is that I've not met a single large enterprise that's only using one hyperscale cloud. And would you like to go ahead and use that utility from each and every one of them while you're using a real backup? That's rude. A third-party backup product for the rest of your environment along the way. And then you see, so that's the left-hand side. I do think it's interesting on the right-hand side. We're going to put agents inside of every VM, and it's just going to work just great. I remember people talking about that 15 years ago when virtualization came out, and it works just as great as it did when you did it on VMware and Hyper-V that many years ago. And then there's native solutions. I'm not trying to bash and trying to be as sarcastic as I can, but I do think it's interesting that there is this same shift that we see every time, which is there's the built-in minimum viable. Then there's we're going to do it the old way because we understand the old way. And then there's where innovation happens, right? And that's kind of depicting the steam here. And what you'll see over time in mainstream is everybody figures out how innovation happens, and these will radically almost invert, usually around year 5 to year 7 on a mainstream curve. So you've been on both sides. And in fact, for a while, you were drinking that blue Kool-Aid. And I promise there's a teal Kool-Aid, works just about the same way. So what are your thoughts on these, and what are you hearing from the customer journey?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's interesting is, maybe 15 years ago, we had to really posture as a third-party vendor to make those emergencies, those plausible emergencies clear, right? Of, well, what would you do if such and such happened? If you're using this first-party solution, how might that play out for you, right? We used to have those conversations. But now I think that everybody's really savvy to the fact that backup is really hard, right? Backup is not something that's super simple. It's not something that's a given. I actually don't think we really need to tell that story anymore. It's really about how do we make sure that we're demonstrating that Veeam is committed to comprehensive and flexible offerings. And that's because what we're recognizing is there's so many point product opportunities. There's so many little touch points, and it doesn't make sense from a business perspective to commit staff members to learning multiple kinds of tools, to trying to manage everything with a central ticketing management system or reporting system like Splunk or whatever. I just don't think that makes sense anymore from a business perspective. And again, when you have those threats like cyber attacks that just continue to come in from all angles, it just makes sense now to really look at what's best. And so we don't necessarily have to sell that story anymore. It becomes so much more about how are we enabling you to do that? How are we enabling you to bring the right people to the table, to evaluate the right strategy, evaluate the right solutions for you, and to really right size and figure out what makes sense. So it's an interesting time in the industry where we're trying to really just help people scramble and figure out from a resource perspective what's going to be best, rather than a lot of this elaborate storytelling.
Yeah. The one thing that I fixated in what you said when thinking about, we don't have to tell because it makes sense. I think the biggest challenge that a lot of organizations have is they're not aware. Right. So if they knew there was a better mousetrap, they would be using the better mousetrap. They're just not aware. Right. And that's the burden on the vendor. Right. That's the burden on us is to make sure folks understand. And so that's why we test in research is not the question, what are you using? But the question was, what are you aware of? Because I got to tell you, over the past couple of years, it's been amazing to watch in the M365 space. And I know that's not entirely your category, but you have some empathy over there, where for far too long, organizations assumed that the recycle bin was good enough until they proved that it wasn't. And then they're like, oh, we do still need backup, right? Thankfully, I think most of the IaaS folks come from an IT pedigree. There's an expectation that built-in is rarely good enough. And so I think they've been taught to look outside of that mantra a little earlier on. Okay, so let's look into our last topic. We're going to cover these. I'm going to cover 2 slides at once, and then we're going to finish off for our time today, because 30 minutes goes just too darn quick when you're having fun. All right. So, we talked about IaaS, right? So this is where you're getting compute and storage and networking, and you're creating your own servers the old-fashioned way. It's just on somebody else's metal. But when you think about that progressive journey from I was on-prem, and now I'm moving into a cloud, for most folks, the nirvana state is not just to run a Windows instance that has a file share in it, or a Windows instance that has a database running inside it, but actually to be using platform as a service, where those foundational services like file sharing and databases is natively delivered by the platform, and you're not having to manage through an OS stack and a compute instance in order to get there. And so this question actually looked at last week. Sam and I talked about the adoption rates and the interest around PaaS for files and PaaS for DVs. So we're going to double click on that now and look at the sentiment around protecting that, because as I mentioned on our last slide, unfortunately, too many people assume that built-in is good enough, or in this case, that PaaS is natively durable and therefore does not require backup. And so we're going to do file, which is the worst case first. And so, Leah, 19%, 1 in 5 organizations says that cloud hosted file share. So that's things like Azure File Share, Azure File Sync, Amazon File, those kind of things, even NetApp ONTAP Cloud Edition, right? All of those natively durable, so you don't have to back them up. Another 15%, so 1 in 5, they got it absolutely wrong. 1 in 7, 15% said we don't have any data in those shares. If I had a nickel for every IT admin who was fired because he didn't think there was anything productive in there and then found out they were wrong. I love the 8% that say they're looking. Yay for them. They're not in the doghouse. But bottom line, only 60% of organizations say they're backing up their file shares that are cloud hosted, right? React to that, and then let's talk about how backup is actually occurring.
Yeah, I'm actually pretty encouraged by that 60%. I think when we look again at the story of what it looks like to adopt solutions, we're probably pacing a little further along than I had expected, which I think is great. Ultimately it comes down to this, and that means the backup admins tend to know better. Right? If we were to split this, I bet you anything you're going to get different answers between the cloud teams versus the backup teams, right, Jason?
You would. And I love the fact is the backup teams become more and more involved. I think you are going to see an improvement in that. No real surprise here of the organizations that are backing up. You are seeing about half of them using that built-in tool. That's very similar to what we saw with the recycle bin and M365 in its early days. And then that would pull back along the way. And then a pretty even balance between those folks that are using a third-party tool, right? Like Veeam as an example, or those using a backup service. And of course, we have tens of thousands of Veeam service providers. I got to tell you, I'm going to go on record on this one. I love the idea of one cloud backing up another cloud. I even have a t-shirt that says that along that way. Hey, we have 1 minute left, so I'm going to fast track us through the exact same story, but a little bit better news. When you look at the database side of things, you see the same basic curve, but thankfully, less people are underestimating the importance of backing up a database than are underestimating the importance of backing up a file share. In this case, 4 out of 5, not 3 out of 5, are doing backups. And yet the math is pretty similar. In this case, though, interestingly enough, even more, a higher percentage of those that are backing up are using one cloud to back up another cloud. And frankly, if my crown jewels were up in a cloud, I'd want a third-party expert being in charge of that backup as well, and not just relying on me being the smartest guy in the room. All right. We don't get a chance to double click on this one because the big hand is almost on the 6. I want to, again, Leah, first and foremost, thank you for joining today. We talked about a lot of good stuff, but I think I could have talked to you for another half hour and still been learning stuff. Make sure to download the report if you haven't already. It's vee.em/CPT23. Be sure to tune in next week. Next week, we will have not only the Dave Russell will be back. We'll be talking about long-term retention, but we'll also Rick is going to be doing the 100th Veeam community wrap-up. It's hard to imagine that, we've had our 100th birthday over here on the Insights team. The Tech Bytes team has had their 100th. Now we're going to do the 100th Veeam community wrap-up as well. That is on Wednesday, not Thursday of next week. So be sure to tune in for that as well. Leah, last word, and then sign us off.
Thank you so much for your partnership and being part of this Veeam community. I think for those of you who are power users of Veeam, the story is pretty clear here that there's a lot to be done in the cloud, whether it's using it for cloud storage or actually protecting those workloads that are rapidly moving to the cloud. We need the backup and admins to be the leaders in telling that story. So thank you so much for joining us.
Sounds good. Take care. See you next week.